Thanks, Andrea. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to learn more about the National Human Trafficking Hotline and our special partnership with the state of Texas. As Andrea said, if you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat box in the GoToMeeting box, and then we will save time at the end to answer those questions. Today's presentation will serve as an introduction to the National Human Trafficking Hotline and child sex trafficking in the United States and Texas. We will discuss how the hotline's specialized partnerships with law enforcement and service providers in Texas enable the hotline to facilitate a coordinated local response to trafficking. And we'll wrap up with a highlight of child sex trafficking statistics in the US and Texas. Our enhanced partnership with Texas is three-pronged. We are collaborating together to raise awareness about child sex trafficking in Texas and raise awareness about the National Human Trafficking Hotline. We are gathering data to inform interventions and prosecutions in Texas, and we are working to create a more robust referral directory for victim services in Texas. Since the beginning of this partnership last September, the hotline has seen a 43% increase in signals from Texas, 19% increase in sex trafficking cases referencing minors, and we have made 294 calls to the Texas Abuse Hotline. We've also made significant revisions to our referral directory, including adding 12 new service providers that are located in Texas, which brings the total number of service providers in Texas listed in the National Referral Directory to 128. Additionally, in collaboration with the Texas Governor's Office, the hotline has made over 75 revisions to the 19 Texas reporting protocols since September of 2018. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is a 24/7 confidential and multilingual lifeline that provides support and a variety of options for survivors of human trafficking to get connected to help and stay safe anywhere in the US and the US territories. We respond to cases of sex and labor trafficking and serve adult and minor victims, US citizens, and foreign nationals. The hotline serves two main functions. We connect trafficking survivors both in and out of their situation to resources and referrals across the country for various social and legal services. It is also an avenue for reporting trafficking situations to trained and trusted law enforcement agencies. We also have a website where people can access general information and statistics about trafficking. Polaris has been operating the National Human Trafficking Hotline since December 7th, 2007. Every 3 years, we must recompete to continue operating the hotline, and have been fortunate to be awarded the cooperative agreement every 3 years since 2007. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is funded by the Department of Health and Human Services and other private donors and supporters. It is important to note that we are not a government entity, a law enforcement agency, or a direct service provider. However, we work closely with these partners in order to support individual victims and survivors of trafficking and the anti-trafficking field. There are several reasons why the hotline works well as a national model, as opposed to, say, a state or local model. For starters, it's a single memorable number. Although movement of a victim is not a requirement for a case to be considered trafficking, traffickers may often move their victims around as a means of control. Therefore, with one memorable number, victims and survivors don't have to spend time researching who to call at their new location, and instead can call our hotline, and we can assess their situation and connect them with the resources in their desired location. That leads me to my next point. The hotline acts as a 24/7 coordination center. We have the infrastructure and resources to assist victims and survivors of the anti-trafficking field 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, anywhere in the US and the US territories, in more than 200 languages, using a teleinterpreter service. It's important to note that the systems, policies, and procedures to operate in this fashion can be very time-consuming to develop and come with quite a price tag. Polaris began operating the hotline about 11 years ago now, with a cordless phone, a handful of staff, and a notepad of paper. Now we have multiple data systems, technologies, and complex shift schedules that allow for 24/7 coverage and the ability to answer multiple calls, texts, chats, emails, and web forms simultaneously. Additionally, for the past 11 years, the hotline has worked with local coalitions, task forces, and other key partners to build a database of over 4,000 service provider and local law enforcement personnel, which allows us to provide a highly localized response, although we are national in scope. Because of this robust database, the hotline is able to manage complex, long-term, and multi-jurisdictional cases, which offers continuity for survivors and others reaching out to the hotline. Next, the hotline is a centralized data collection and analysis hub. This allows us to detect new trends and identify promising practices and gaps in trafficking networks, in law enforcement response, and in victim services. Lastly, we have government support, yet we have the NGO independence. With government support and funding, the hotline is sustainable, but it is also important that we have the independence and separation from the government in order to build the trust needed among survivors and community members, and to make sure we remain flexible to adapt as the anti-trafficking landscape evolves. While many of these components sound feasible for a local hotline to accomplish, capacity and funding restraints can make it difficult for smaller entities to provide the continuity of care that survivors want, regardless of their location or complexity of their needs. As of January 2018, the National Hotline offers signalers 5 options to reach out for assistance: phone, text, chat, email, and online tip form. Together, we call those signals. People can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline toll-free at 888-373-7888. And this line is answered live 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Callers can speak with a hotline advocate in English or Spanish, or in more than 200 additional languages using a 24-hour teleinterpreting service. Hearing and speech impaired individuals can contact the hotline by dialing 711, which is the free national access number that connects to telecommunications relay services. People can also text help or info to 233-733, which, if you spell it out, spells be free, in English or Spanish. And they can chat us via the National Hotline's web portal in English and Spanish. They can email at help@humantraffickinghotline.org, or report a tip online using our online tip reporting form. In order to give you an idea of our scope and our capacity, here is a brief overview of our key hotline statistics from 2007 to 2017. We've identified and responded to over 42,000 cases of human trafficking. We've reported 10,000 of those cases to law enforcement. We have built and continue to manage over 290 referral and reporting protocols that Sam will talk about in just a minute. And we've had over 9,500 survivors contact the hotline directly for assistance. We recognize these numbers are only through 2017. We are excited to announce that we will likely be launching our 2018 statistics at the end of July, so stay tuned for those. This chart specifically provides a breakdown of calls related to the types of cases made by individuals contacting the hotline in 2017. Crisis calls make up about 10% of our signals, and there are numerous other reasons why someone might call the hotline, and it is not always a survivor calling directly. Tips and high-risk situations each make up about 1/3 of our calls, and high-risk situations include calls that may not have had enough indicators of human trafficking, such as not having enough info about force, fraud, or coercion, but are considered to be high-risk situations for human trafficking. They might be sexual assault, domestic violence, labor exploitation. Calls with the primary purpose of getting a referral make up about 13% of our requests, and the remaining calls are for general information or technical assistance. In 2017, there were over 8,500 human trafficking cases reported to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and we expect that number to be closer to about 11,000 for 2018. The red areas on this heat map indicate the highest concentration of cases handled by the hotline. It's critical that we note that this map does not highlight the prevalence of trafficking in the U.S., but instead reflects where there is awareness about the issue of trafficking and the National Human Trafficking Hotline. As an aside, this map and other national and state-specific statistics are available on our website and can be critical tools when advocating for additional trafficking-specific resources and funding. As I mentioned, in 2017, we responded to over 8,500 cases of trafficking, and in 2018, we expect them to be over 11,000, which is a nearly 30% increase in cases. While this trajectory is staggering, it can be seen as a positive that more and more people are learning about trafficking and that there are resources such as the hotline available to assist those in need. Just as with trafficking cases year over year, we continue to see an increase in our hotline signals. Again, a signal is all 5 types of the ways people can contact us: phone, chat, text, email, and web form. We are projecting that we are going to have a 21% increase in signals in 2018 over 2017. We attribute this dramatic increase to greater awareness and growing trust in the hotline, as well as the addition of 24/7 chat and text in 2018. A question we often get is, who can call the hotline? Who called you? You don't actually get calls from the victims, right? The short answer is yes, we get calls from everyone. The National Hotline serves the entire U.S. and the U.S. territories. Anyone in need of assistance or information and resources related to the issue of human trafficking can contact the National Hotline and access our services. We get calls from everyone, from the survivor themselves, both in and out of the situations, as well as concerned family and friends. Service providers and law enforcement seeking assistance on behalf of the survivor, and a range of community members and other professionals wanting to report a tip or assist a survivor. Many people we speak with are surprised to hear that survivors of trafficking reach out at all. In fact, survivors of trafficking were the second most common caller type reaching out to the hotline in 2017, second only to community members reaching out to report tips. Additionally, our data shows that more and more survivors are reaching out to the hotline year over year. You can see from this graph that both the numbers of signals we receive from survivors and the number of survivors themselves is increasing year to year. I want to highlight here that the line that says unique survivors, which is the yellow line, is the number of survivors reaching out directly to the hotline. And each survivor might call the hotline 1, 2, 3 times, and that is the red line, the number of signals from survivors. Is how many calls, texts, chats, emails, and web forms came from the unique survivor. On average, survivors are generally contacting the hotline about 2 to 3 times. It's common for survivors to call the hotline multiple times to build trust in the hotline before ever asking for assistance. That being said, over the past few years, the ratio of number of signals to the number of unique survivors is decreasing, which we hope means that the hotline is becoming more efficient in addressing the survivors' needs. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jenny and Sam, who are going to talk a bit more practically about what happens when someone contacts the hotline.
One of the reasons we think we've been able to build up such trust among survivors is that all communication with the hotline is confidential, including the caller's contact information. The caller is in control of how much they choose to share and also what information is shared external to the hotline. There are, of course, exceptions, such as when the caller provides reportable details about a minor being abused, neglected, or trafficked, that the caller is in imminent danger, threatens to harm themselves or others, or otherwise gives explicit permission to be contacted by law enforcement or service providers. In regards to confidentiality, the caller in reality has several options when contacting the national hotline. They can request to remain anonymous, meaning that they wish to remain anonymous to both the hotline and any external parties we may be contacting on their behalf. They may wish to be confidential, meaning that they're willing for the hotline to know who they are and to be contacted by the hotline, but they don't want the hotline to share their information with any external parties, law enforcement, or service providers. And then, of course, they may be willing to be contacted both by the hotline as well as those law enforcement and service providers that we involve in the case. It's important to remember, though, that callers are in control of how much information that they provide and have the option of remaining anonymous as long as they haven't yet provided that identifying information. Also of note, the hotline does not record any calls, and so that adds that added level of security for that individual who wishes to remain anonymous. As Caroline noted before, anyone can contact the hotline, whether it be to get advice, report a tip, or get connected to services. Because of this, I'm going to go through what to expect when someone calls the hotline. So every call, text, and chat will contain the same core components, even though every response will be unique, just as every situation is unique. So every signal will begin with assessing the signaler's safety and continually assessing that victim or survivor's safety throughout the life cycle of the case. We'll then assess the needs and purpose of this signal to the hotline. We'll assess the situation for trafficking to make sure that it's within our scope. And then we'll respond to the signaler's needs, whether it be to report the trafficking situation or to provide a referral to a service provider. And then we'll follow up with any next steps, referrals, or reports that are needed based on the needs and situation of the signal. So I'm going to break off each core component. This first few slides are about the safety assessment, and so you can see an example of how a text communication may proceed through the hotline. So, like I said, safety is key. We begin every call and signal with a safety check to make sure that first, it's safe to talk, and second, to understand the limits of safely communicating. How long will they be safe to talk? How will we know as the hotline when it's no longer safe for them to talk? And what particular dangers are there? If the person calling us is in immediate danger, we'll advise them to hang up and call 911. Otherwise, we'll fully assess the signaler's safety as needed and work with the survivor to create a safety plan. This is also where we'll try to address the issue of confidentiality and the scope of the hotline so that the signaler is aware of our reporting obligations and can control the amount of information that they provide. Our top priority is safety and the potential victims reaching out to us. So depending on the situation, this part of the conversation may dominate the signal before we're able to further assess needs and be able to further assess trafficking. So here in this example, you can see that the potential victim texted help into our Be-Free text line at 233-733 and how that conversation may begin. So in this mock situation, we ask if they're safe to text right now. The victim indicates that somebody that they appear to be afraid of is coming back soon. And so the first thing we did was set up a code word that will let us know that it's no longer safe for them to talk and what that means. So in this case, if they say red, then we should stop texting. If they say green, that means that it's safe again to text. If the potential victim is a minor, then we care about all the same elements as far as safety as we would for adults, but we're also reiterating our obligations to involve law enforcement in order to ensure that they're safe. If the situation is an urgent situation that requires an immediate law enforcement response, then we will typically be trying to make that call at the same time as the signal. If the signal is coming in through text or chat, then either the chat or text specialist or another advocate or supervisor will call out to one of our 24-hour contacts while still communicating with the potential victim. It's important to note, however, that chat and text conversations are often very long and drawn out, and we may not get the information indicating that the person is a minor until well into the conversation. If it's a call, then we may have another advocate or supervisor call out to law enforcement while the advocate is still communicating with the potential victim. However, depending on capacity, the advocate taking the call may call law enforcement immediately after collecting the necessary information from the signaler and make a plan for the potential victim to call us back when it's safe again. In this scenario, I validate the potential victim's fears, but reiterate that we care about them and want them to be safe and are therefore required to involve law enforcement for help because they're a minor. At that point, the potential victim may stop communicating with us if they're afraid of a law enforcement response, and we will then only be able to share the minimal information we have collected so far. In other situations, the potential victim may be scared, but ultimately still willing to communicate with the advocate and provide the requested information. In these types of situations, we would continue to assess for different areas of safety and any other safety and danger information that law enforcement may need to know in order to respond. Here I'm assessing for where her potential trafficker is and the location of anyone else who she may be afraid of. There are several other questions that we may ask in order to assess for safety of the situation, and here are some examples. One important question to ask is where the person that they are afraid of is, and are they a threat? Is there somebody monitoring them, or are they a threat? In this case, she mentioned that the potential trafficker's sister, so we also want to know where she is and if she's a threat. Is there anyone else around who may hurt you? Is the potential victim hurt? Do they need medical attention? Is that something that needs to be addressed right now because it's something, a medical emergency, or is it just that also when we have somebody respond, they need to be aware of that medical condition? Are there any other potential victims? What are their conditions? How long will they be safe to text? Is anybody monitoring their phone or their communication? If they're texting us, then we'll encourage them to delete their text if they think that somebody may see them and that will cause a threat to them. Same with chat, to make sure that they delete their browser and search histories, or any phone calls that they've made to helpers that may cause danger for them. Also, are the people that she's with armed? Do they have weapons? Where are those weapons? Can she get to a place that's far away from those weapons so that if the situation escalates, she's in the least amount of danger? Also, what do you expect will happen if they find your text, and what they expect will happen if law enforcement does respond to the situation? That will help us understand the lethality of the situation, as well as help law enforcement inform their response so that they can expect if they're going to go into a very hostile situation. This assessment will go on for as long as needed, depending on the situation. In urgent situations, where we've quickly identified the need is extraction or otherwise leaving their situation, our primary focus is on safety. Throughout the safety assessment, we will be trying to assess for trafficking to the extent necessary in order to determine if we are the right fit. But depending on the urgency of the situation, that may be limited to asking questions to confirm, is someone making you have sex for money, drugs, etc., or is someone forcing you to work against your will? If they answer yes to that or some other version of that question, then we'll stop assessing to determine if it's trafficking and focus on questions related to safety and information that will help law enforcement in their immediate response. Additional trafficking assessments may resume on a later signal from the potential victim, but in a crisis situation, getting all of the details of the trafficking situation is not a priority. It's also sometimes a fine balance between maintaining trust with the potential victim and getting enough information to confirm trafficking and inform law enforcement. If the crisis situation involves an adult that does not require a report to law enforcement, then we will focus on the safety assessment and questions related to connecting the potential victim to a service provider. These are usually limited to the eligibility requirements of the service provider, meaning the type of trafficking they experience, their age, their gender, or their nationality. However, if it's a situation involving a minor, we do try to get enough information about them, such as their location, and about their traffickers in order to help law enforcement respond to an immediate situation without being too pushy and driving the potential victim away. Ultimately, as we discussed in the confidentiality slide, it's up to them to provide that information, and sometimes we have limited details to share. While safety is a critical component of what we do on every signal, only about 10% of our signals are crisis situations that will require such a lengthy safety assessment. The other main component which makes up our response and follow-up to all situations is assessing the needs of the caller, and particularly the survivor if the call is about a specific trafficking situation. Since our hotline has a very specific scope, we want to triage the call as soon as we safely can in order to determine if we can meet the needs of the caller. Some people reach out and may not know who we are or what our limitations are, so in order to have them not spend too much time talking about a difficult situation, we make sure they're calling about a trafficking situation and that they're looking to either report their situation or get connected to services. If they're not in a trafficking situation or are not ready to report or get connected to services, we help them connect to a more appropriate resource as able. If the caller text is about a particular trafficking situation, but the caller is not the survivor themselves, then you can expect our advocate to assess for the wishes and needs of the survivor. This is particularly true of adult survivors who may not want law enforcement involved for a variety of reasons. These include, but are certainly not limited to, that it might not be safe at that moment to involve law enforcement, that the victim may have received threats about either reporting or involving law enforcement in any way, or the potential victim might not identify as a victim to law enforcement and therefore could suffer unintended consequences, such as being retaliated against by the potential trafficker, as well as potentially arrested by the law enforcement officer. Regardless of their age, we will try to get them connected to services if that's what they're seeking. Referral requests may be for case management, housing and shelter, legal services, counseling, or other mental health services. Also includes transportation assistance, among others. We will usually try to encourage the signaler to work with an existing case manager if there is one. But if there's not, or the situation is out of the current case manager's scope, then we are happy to connect to another resource or to work with the current case management team, depending on the signaler's wishes. We'll talk in a minute about our referral process, but first I want to talk a bit about our trafficking assessment, since we do need to complete some form of assessment in order to determine the best fit for referrals. On every call, after an initial safety and needs assessment, we also have to complete the trafficking assessment. Again, this is to determine if our resources are the right fit for the person calling us. We use the action means purpose model to do this, also known as the AMP model. At minimum, callers can expect us to confirm that there is an action, that there's some sort of recruitment, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person through the means of forced fraud or coercion for the purpose of a commercial sex act or forced labor. If the situation involves a minor in a commercial sex situation, we will not need to confirm a means per the statute. That means that there does not need to be an element of forced fraud or coercion if a minor is engaged in commercial sex. It's important to note here that we do not have the ability to certify that a situation is in fact trafficking, which is why we report things as potential victims and potential trafficking. We are ourselves not an investigative agency, and we cannot say for certain that the potential victims we refer or report on behalf of are in fact victims of trafficking. Additionally, we don't have the ability to meet people face to face, making it difficult to verify people's ages and identities. However, because we take a survivor-centered and trauma-informed approach, we take what the potential victim tells us at face value and take into consideration the re-traumatizing effects of retelling one's story repeatedly. With that in mind, we come back to the caller's expressed need. If the caller is simply seeking a referral for services and we've already identified a potential trafficking via the AMP model, we limit the assessment questions to only those we need in order to make a good referral. This is because we know that service providers will almost always have to conduct their own intake assessment, and again, we're trying to mitigate how many times they have to retell their story. However, if someone is seeking to report their situation or a situation they observed, then we will complete a thorough assessment and collect all relevant safety and trafficking details for law enforcement to respond appropriately. As I've mentioned, though, callers are ultimately in control of how much information they're willing to provide the hotline. We will not pressure someone to report or provide more information than they're comfortable telling, though we may ask clarifying questions in order to determine if the situation is within our scope and what resources are the best fit. In the cases where someone is reaching out to us to get connected to service providers for resources or seeking assistance in a crisis situation, our advocates are able to tap into a network of nearly 3,000 service providers. Each referral given to a signaler is based on their unique needs, situation, and demographics. If a survivor is unable or doesn't want to get in contact with the hotline, they can also use our online public referral directory, which is located on our website, to search for specialized human trafficking resources in their area. This directory has more than 600 human trafficking specific direct and indirect service providers. Before we go into what happens when we report, I do want to just touch base on what it means to be included in the directory and how to apply. When a service provider applies to be included in the public referral directory or our internal database, which expands beyond just anti-trafficking resources, but any provider that's willing to serve survivors, we go through a vetting process in order to determine if they are a good fit. We believe quality services can be provided when an organization demonstrates these qualities: that the organization appears to practice victim-centeredness, that they appear to have sustainable managerial practices, that they are equipped to provide services to trafficking survivors, and that also goes along with being willing to serve trafficking survivors, and that the organization appears collaborative with potential partners in their area that are already working on trafficking. One of the major benefits of this new partnership is that we have our partners at the governor's office and on the ground to help in vetting organizations that apply to the directory. So when the survivor reaches out for options on leaving their situation, we can tap into our internal resources and find either an anti-trafficking organization that can help or another organization who is otherwise willing and able to help survivors of trafficking. A critical feature of being included in the directory is being available to respond to regular update requests. This year, I've initiated the first round of annual update requests to all of the service providers in our directory, and all of the requests have at this point been sent out to our Texas service providers. So if you are a Texas service provider and believe you're part of our directory and have not received an email from me, please check your spam folder. And if it's not in there, then please reach out to me and I would be happy to make sure that your information is updated in our system. And then, as I mentioned, as Caroline mentioned earlier, we do now have 128 service providers included in the directory. Since the start of our enhanced partnership with Texas, we added 12 service provider partners that are located in Texas. 9 of the new additions were included also in the public directory, bringing the total number of providers in the public directory in Texas to 57. 3 of the new providers were identified as having particular specialization in serving vulnerable populations, including refugee asylum seekers, ethnic minorities, homeless populations, people with HIV/AIDS, and religious, social, and political minority groups. Additionally, 11 of the 12 new providers do provide direct services to minors, bringing the total number of providers serving minors in Texas to 92. And then when someone does want to get connected to these referral resources that we have access to, our preferred response is to warm transfer the signaler indirectly with the service provider using the service provider's preferred referral method. Sometimes that's through a private number that only the hotline has access to. An important note about that is that if you are only using the online public directory and are having difficulty accessing or seeing service providers you believe are in the area, you can always reach out to the hotline, and the hotline may have access that the public directory does not. If the signaler is unable to warm transfer, then we'll offer the best public referral information we have and provide it on the call, text, or chat, or email, and give any necessary instructions while managing expectations about the service provider's ability to respond through that public contact method. If the best method of referral is a private contact number, we'll attempt to get permission for the service provider to contact the potential victim directly so that we can make the call on the behalf of the potential victim and have the service provider call out to the potential victim themselves. An alternative is to make a plan for the hotline to call out to the potential victim and reach back after a reasonable amount of time if they wish to remain anonymous. I'm going to pass it on to Sam, who's going to talk more about our reporting protocols and the way that law enforcement is involved in the hotline's response.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Gillis. I manage our law enforcement partnership sorry, having some technical restructuring over here, and our reports that go out to law enforcement. So for situations where reporting is required or appropriate, or a survivor calls in requiring immediate assistance from a service provider, we utilize our referral and reporting protocols that include networks of trained law enforcement and service providers that can provide emergency services or coordination. The hotline has built up these protocols over time. Currently, we have 290 emergency protocols based on geographic area. You can see this map here. Each shape on the map represents a particular protocol with law enforcement. So like generally FBI, HSI, funded and unfunded task forces, local and state partners, et cetera. And then service providers that can also coordinate the emergency response side. These include not only folks that we report out our written tips to, like our law enforcement contacts, but they also include folks that we can call in emergencies 24/7. So the service provider organizations that are listed on these protocols are members of our directory that Jenny went over, but they are only a subset of those that can provide direct emergency services like shelter, or that they are the ones that can coordinate the crisis services. Before I move forward a little bit, I just want you guys to please note that this is an older map. We have different technology now, so it doesn't reflect exactly how our protocols are broken down at this moment in time, but the visuals just here is meant to give you an idea of how diverse they can look state to state, within a state, and across the country. So just keep that in mind. The ultimate goal of these protocols is to match or work effectively within the anti-trafficking landscape in a given area. So in order to do that, we work with the relevant stakeholders in that locale to build them up. So think local, state, and or federal law enforcement, government agencies like the Texas Governor's Office, and service providers in general. So because of this, the contacts included on the reporting protocols and coverage area also varies. So protocols could be hyper-local, dictating our response only in a single county, more regionally based, so think like multi-county or state-based, and include the contacts that work human trafficking cases in that area. So usually this is a combination of local, state, and federal, but in some areas it's maybe a combination of one or two. Depending on what the group wants, the hotline could report to a single point of contact, multiple members of a task force, or more of an informal group of individuals that collaborate and deconflict effectively in that area. So the contacts that receive a certain tip can also be broken down more granularly to serve the group as well. So for example, some protocols, the contacts on those protocols will receive all tips no matter the content of that tip. On others, we report to specific contacts based on the type of potential trafficking happening. So think if it's a sex or labor trafficking situation, or the population involved. So if it's an adult or a minor, or it's involving US citizens or foreign nationals. We can break it all down depending on what the area wants. So in Texas specifically, Caroline mentioned that we currently have 19 reporting protocols, and they cover all 254 counties. As you know, the state is pretty diverse in terms of population, community, and trafficking response infrastructure. So as such, there are some hyper-local county-level protocols, like those we have around Travis County, Dallas, and Tarrant counties. But we also have a significant number of regional protocols that encompass a cluster of counties. Some of the regional protocols are relatively small, like our Houston protocol that reflects the counties within the HATRA group, so the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance. This is similar with some of the other BJIE funded groups, like around Waco, for example. Some of the larger regional protocols typically cover 2 to 3 dozen counties, but we're working with the governor's office to refine those a little bit further. It's also important to just note that because the protocols are reflective of the field, and we work in a field that is filled with natural attrition, changes in funding all the time, shifting areas of responsibility in politics, they're always in flux, and we are responding to those, but also trying to be proactive in the way that we build them up. If you are not included on these distribution lists for any reason and feel that you should be, please feel free to email me directly. My info is going to be available along with my colleagues at the very end of the presentation. So all of our reports to law enforcement are sent out to the contacts on those protocols that I just mentioned, and they go out via email to a distro list of folks. So we will supplement our written reports with a call out to the emergency 24 contacts I mentioned that we had access to on the cases that require that immediate response, or if they are tricky or sensitive for any reason and we kind of just want to talk through some things with contacts to see if we should report to maybe like a subset of that group, or if there's just a couple of things that maybe might not want to write down the email. It's just good to be able to reach out to those folks and have an ear at any time. So Jenny also highlighted the hotline's confidentiality policy earlier, which indicates that we're not required to report all of our incoming cases to law enforcement, and that signalers can choose to remain anonymous, confidential, or elect to share their contact information externally. She also highlighted the situations where we are required to report to law enforcement and Child Protective Services. And so just to recap, those are anything involving a minor in danger. So clearly that includes minors in trafficking situations. Anything where we think there might be imminent harm, where we hear active violence over the phone, or in situations where survivors explicitly ask us to report their situations to law enforcement. So those are the 4 main buckets where we are required. So of those 4 groups, we're required to report the situations involving minors, those involving imminent harm, and those where we hear active violence on the phone to law enforcement within 0 to 2 hours. So that's the top level of this pyramid here. And the other required bucket where adult survivors want to report their situations, depending on the urgency of that, that will dictate whether it's in the urgent response, I guess, triangle here, or if it falls into the non-urgent situation, like if they were calling to report a historic situation that they experienced and they want to report their trafficker primarily, but there's no emergent need. An urgent example of that could be a potential victim reaching out for immediate assistance or needing to be removed from a situation. But because the hotline takes a victim-centered and harm reduction approach, every situation is different, and we evaluate it for reporting on a case-by-case basis, considering various nuance factors. I'm going to go into this in a little bit, maybe in the next 2 slides or so, but the non-urgent tips are where we have more discretion clearly in that analysis. And so the non-urgent tips will go out within 24 hours after they've been reported or after they've been reviewed by our internal team here. So knowing that, I kind of wanted to just highlight for you what happens in Texas with cases of potential sex trafficking of minors specifically. So a signal will come into the hotline, whether that's call, text, web form, chat, what have you. We will get all of the information necessary and do our assessment over the phone that Jenny went over. We will go over our mandated reporting and confidentiality policies, assess their safety needs, trafficking, and then we will try to either get the caller to make a report themselves to the Texas Abuse Hotline. If they do not want to do that for any reason, we will then do that on their behalf. When they do elect to do that, we will be connecting them with the hotline via a warm transfer. After that point, the hotline will then start crafting a written report with all of the relevant information that we took from that signal. So that report will also include all of the information that either that caller or our advocate reported to the Texas Abuse Hotline. And then from there, our written report will be sent out to the law enforcement contacts specified on the reporting protocol for that area, as well as the director of the Human Trafficking and Child Exploitation Unit within the Department of Family and Protective Services, the Texas DPS, the Department of Public Safety Human Trafficking Unit email, and a supervisor above that unit. So those three prongs will happen across the entire state of Texas, regardless of the individual local protocol. And this is done to promote collaboration and aid in deconfliction between law enforcement and the FPS and the state level agency, and vice versa, if there's going to be any co-occurring investigations or if they need to share information. And so, as I mentioned before, there's several factors to consider when we're determining whether or not the hotline is obligated to report a situation or whether it's prudent to do so. These here are the primary considerations that case reviewers are going to be thinking about on the hotline when they're deciding to assign a report or not. So first, consent from a victim, age, and the safety of individuals involved are the most important factors that we consider when weighing whether or not we're going to do that. Our hotline supervisors are notified by our hotline advocates, so the folks taking the calls and responding to signals in the hotline room about cases involving minors or cases involving imminent harm. So they will be reviewing and assigning the urgent reports quickly, taking into account more of these definitive considerations for reporting, so urgency and safety concerns, age, versus some of the other ones. The non-urgent cases are reviewed by our case response specialist team. So they work to ensure that there's a holistic response to cases coming in through the hotline and make decisions about whether or not to report to law enforcement on a case-by-case basis, evaluating all of these nuanced factors here in the case, and trying to determine all those factors when you put them together as a whole. Does reporting, what's going to be the least harm for the individual? So would reporting be beneficial, or may it ultimately cause more harm? We do this because, as Jenny went over, reporting to law enforcement may not be the best solution for every case in every area, especially for adults who will not identify as victims when approached, who have a contentious history with law enforcement, or who might be fearful due to their legal status in the U.S. Additionally, the hotline will really heavily take into account the reporting protocols that I went over here. So some of the nuanced factors that they are going over might bring them down to a kind of 50-50 decision of, you know, it could be helpful to report this, or it might ultimately cause more harm. The reason the protocols are so important is because in those situations, particularly, they're looking at the strength of our reporting protocols, and we're very proud of our partnerships that we have with Texas. So when it comes down to those situations, we can say, okay, we trust the contacts here, they do really great work, and we think that reporting would ultimately cause less harm. So I'm not going to go into much more detail about that because that's mostly involving adults, but I'm going to, you can feel free to ask questions at the end if you have more related to that, but I am going to jump through now and talk about some of our statistics. So all of the data that we're going to be going over here pertains to data that's come into the hotline involving potential situations of minor sex trafficking and minor sex and labor trafficking. So what's excluded here is exclusively labor cases involving potential minors. We loop in the sex and labor cases because there are situations where it's kind of co-occurring, and we think that they should be included in that data. So the next slides that we're going to go over include the data reported to the hotline between January 1st, 2015 and October 31st, 2018. So that is 3 years. Here we've noted here the top 5 states of those 2 types of trafficking across the U.S. So Texas comes in second pretty consistently with 650 cases that were reported to the hotline in that time frame. Again, that is January 1st, 2015 to October 31st, 2018. This slide breaks down the potential cases of sex trafficking and sex and labor trafficking involving minors during that same time frame. On the left in blue, you'll see the number of cases and associated minor victims in the United States. And then on the right, you'll see the comparison for numbers in Texas. So in the United States, there were 7,040 cases of potential trafficking. And of those cases, 8,348 potential victims were mentioned in those cases. In Texas, there were the 658 cases that I mentioned, and within those cases, there were 788 potential victims identified. Now we're just going to break down some of the national trends within those cases across the country, and then compare it to Texas. So it's all across the same time frame as well. So of the 7,040 cases of potential sex and labor trafficking in the U.S., escort services with 1,799 cases was the top type that we are seeing. Escort services, we define this as commercial sex acts that occur at temporary indoor locations. So temporary is kind of the key to think about here. Also largely connected with online ads, and the in-call, out-call models with generally open networks. This is kind of the main type that you think about. Second is residence-based commercial sex with 699 cases. That's just a fancy word for saying potential trafficking occurring in the home. This could be organized traffickers using private homes, or more familial or intimate partner traffickers that we would consider a little less organized. Third, we have outdoor solicitation with 529 cases. So in this type, potential victims are being forced to walk the street or the track, as well as truck stops or rest stops. Fourth, we have pornography, so child pornography. These are pre-recorded images of children in sex acts. So we have a different category for the more live, remote sex acts. So those are not included in this number. And then fifth, we have illicit massage businesses. So these are the massage parlor cases that are operating under the guise of legitimate businesses. And these also tend to be open networks. So again, that was all for the national level trend. Moving into Texas, we see a lot of these same networks pop up. So escort services are still first. That's pretty standard in every state. So that's 168 cases that we have here. For residence-based commercial sex in Texas over that time frame, we had 71 cases. But what is notable here is the difference in the third place. We had 45 cases referencing bars, clubs, and cantinas. So it's notable, again, that this is different. So for those of you that are a little less familiar with this type, these are the fronts of legitimate bars, restaurants, or clubs selling food and alcohol while exploiting victims for both sex and labor behind the scenes. So in cantinas specifically, victims are forced to provide customers with flirtatious companionship, essentially to entice them to purchase high-priced alcoholic beverages that often come with an explicit or implicit agreement for the commercial sex act to follow. Some of these locations are run entirely by organized human trafficking networks. Other locations, traffickers tend to have agreements with business owners that allow them to operate out of the location in exchange for a portion of the profits. And then down in foot massage businesses with 41 in the state of Texas. So I went over a lot of data pretty quickly, and we are going to jump to our question sections here, so you can ask any questions about that or any of the other information that came up throughout the course of the presentation.
We don't see, there don't seem to be any questions in the chat box.
Actually,
so go ahead.
We have some here. I can read them to you.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question is, will the PowerPoint be available after the webinar? Can we make that available, Caroline?
Yes, and you're recording it too, right? So you'll put it on your website?
Yes,
Yep,
so the webinar will be recorded, and we can send out a link to everyone. It'll be on our website, and then the PowerPoint, we can probably send a PDF to everyone.
Exactly.
The second question is, given that callers make the choice about what the hotline can share, do you track caller ID information or phone number information?
No, we do not. We really try to maintain a confidential space, so callers, we will honor their anonymity when they're calling. In very rare situations where it's incredibly dangerous or urgent, we are able to go through a process to get those numbers, but it's not something that we can readily see.
Okay. Is the directory able to be downloaded, and is it Texas specific?
The directory is nationwide, just like the hotline. That way, if somebody is maybe in Texas but looking for residential programs elsewhere, they have the ability to be able to look in any state for those services. The directory cannot be downloaded at this point. So what's searchable is what's there.
Okay, we have a couple more coming in. So do callers take notes? I think they meant, do the hotline advocates take notes, since phone calls are not recorded, just in case the victim forgets something? Would there be notes available, like if the victim calls back?
Yes, so we do, that's why we call it a case. We do keep track of the case itself. That way, when a survivor, regardless of their anonymity, does want to reach back out again, we're not starting from scratch and having to re-explain anything. We have confidential notes that we do not share with anybody. The notes are completely internal, that are just an overview of what was discussed during that signal. That way it maintains continuity, so that in an hour or 2 hours or a week or a year, if the signaler calls back out and it's a new advocate taking the signal, they'll know exactly where we left off, so that we don't have to waste any time.
Okay. People are asking for our website again, so y'all will be able to access the webinar, and it's gov.texas.gov/CSTT, as in Child Sex Trafficking Team. Let's see. Are you guys using a specific assessment tool on the hotline? And if so, can you share that information?
No, we have a lot of internal resources that we use to help guide certain discussions that have worked in certain situations. But because we recognize that every situation is very unique and requires a nuanced response, we want to make sure that our advocates are thinking very clearly through the situation at hand and not applying a cookie cutter approach. And so we do not have a specific protocol that we use or a specific set of questions. We're guided by that action means purpose model, and looking at, are we meeting those three things in order to determine if it's trafficking, and then determining how much more we need to ask depending on the need and purpose of that signal.
Okay. We have a couple of questions asking about, like, are there specific services to help specific kinds of victims in Texas? And I would just ask that you guys look at the database at the hotline, and actually you can look into that yourself by typing it in. Like, for example, you could find residential services for minors. You could find services for boys, that sort of thing. Am I right, you guys, at the hotline? I think I'm right.
Yes. And
Okay,
if
good.
there aren't, yes, and if they aren't able to find a referral online, we do have a more robust database that can be accessed from our hotline advocates. So if you are having difficulty finding something online, feel free to call us, but do definitely feel empowered to try to search yourself at first, and then call in if necessary.
And just to add to that, this is Jenny again. You can search by the demographics, so adult versus minor, male, female, transgender female, foreign nationals or U.S. citizens. It also has an option to search for organizations that particularly specialize in serving a vulnerable population. And so if you're working with a survivor who identifies as LGBTQ, you can add that added filter to find organizations that have been identified as having that particular competency. And so you can search by the demographics, by the specialization and the service. And I just want to add another note that besides the direct services that we have listed, you can also search for resources in the anti-trafficking field, such as volunteer opportunities, training opportunities, and other outreach and awareness services that our providers may also offer.
Great. Speaking of calling in, we have the question that comes up often: what is the average hold time for people who call the hotline?
So currently, it varies by the time of day, as our busiest time of day is usually around 11 to 7, thinking that all time zones are working during that time. In the morning hours, in the early hours, we are East Coast, we're based in DC. In our morning hours, it's about 2 minutes. In the afternoon, it can be 3 to 4 minutes. And then overnight, it really is more like 1 to 2 minutes. Ideally, we don't have any wait time, but we are limited in our capacity. And if we get a surge of calls all at once, we are limited to who is working at that time. We do stagger our shifts of advocates to ensure that as call volume ramps up throughout the day, we do have more and more people working. I think it is important to note, while we are funded by, partially funded by Health and Human Services, currently at $1.75 million, it's a $4.5 million operation. We do also have this special partnership with Texas, but our capacity, we are a bit thin at some points. We do encourage, if people are struggling to reach us and need to quickly, to reach out via text or chat, and hopefully we always have someone who is assigned to digital communications during all shifts of the day, and so that might be a way to get through faster if you're unable to reach us on call or on the phone, or if you've been on hold a while. We do use an interactive voice recognition service, or an IVR, which is press 1 for Spanish, press 2 for crisis. And so we do have an option that if someone is calling in a crisis, that they can choose an option that will jump the line. And that's available both in English and Spanish.
Great. So a couple of questions about your hotline staff, your hotline advocates. Are they all employed? Are there any that are volunteers? And what kind of training do they get?
That's a great question. So we currently have about 75 people on the hotline team. 50 of those are our hotline advocates who are answering the signals that come in. 25 of those are part-time and 25 are full-time. They go through, and the remaining people involved in the team are our hotline supervisors, who provide direct supervision to the hotline advocates, and then also act as a shifty and help run the room and make sure calls are being responded to, and we're providing the best response in the moment, especially with urgent and minor cases. And then we have our case response specialist team, who is reviewing cases that might need a more nuanced response. We were having difficulty finding the best resource on the phones. They're able to take a little bit of a deeper dive into cases to make sure we provide the best response. And then we have our partnership managers, Jenny and Sam, who are here, and a few other people on the leadership team, our training managers specifically, as you mentioned. We require every hotline advocate to participate in a 2-week training. It's about 96 hours, and that includes shadowing. They learn not only practical skills to work on a hotline, but learn a lot of content specific to trafficking, but also to how to respond specifically to different types of signals coming into the hotline.
Great. If you recognize that a caller does not fit within the trafficking profile, do you still offer referral to community services? How do you handle that?
That's a great question, because we do recognize our limitations and our scope, and also that we just aren't the best resource for some of those other high-risk situations. If it is a high-risk situation that we commonly receive, we have a very quick reference list of the best resource for that situation. So we'll have the National Domestic Violence Hotline number at hand, the RAIN hotline at hand, the National Crime Victims Hotline at hand. That way, because they will have the specialized resources, it doesn't make sense for our advocates to take time to provide, you know, even though we have domestic violence organizations in our system, that might not be the best provider for them in that situation. And so we'll try to transfer them to those better providers as quickly as we can.
Okay, and there was a question about what the future of our partnership will be, like what other goals we have for our partnership. I can say from our perspective at the Child Sex Trafficking team, we're just seeing such a great response, but we do know we need to get the word out more, and so we have some plans to do targeted social media in places that have some services in place for victims and maybe some law enforcement activity, but we don't see a lot of calls to the hotline. So that's kind of in plans. We also have a blog post that is coming out from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, I think from Brad Miles, that's going to talk about the partnership and what we've achieved so far. And we're going to be asking people to kind of spread the word on that and raise awareness on both of those things. Do y'all have anything you want to add?
Yeah, definitely. This is Jenny again. I just want to add that our partnership is definitely integral to helping to build out the directory. Andrea and the team at the governor's office is very helpful in identifying new organizations opening up on the ground that can be added to the directory and giving them the information to be added or letting me know. And then also, because of the directory being the scope that it is and that we're working so closely together, we can share that information about what providers are on the ground, providing what services to which populations, so that Texas can see where the needs are a little bit more in depth. And so they can identify when, you know, maybe there's a lot of providers offering services to females, but services to those that don't identify as female might be more limited. And so they can analyze that and see where they can either look to expand services or identify new providers that can fill in some of those gaps, and continuously using that feedback loop between our organizations.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. We have one about, have you ever been subpoenaed for the information received from a victim on the hotline?
Yes, it is a rare case that we get subpoenaed. However, I think the more we see cases being prosecuted, which is a good thing, we have seen more and more subpoenas come. Generally, we work very closely with a pro bono law firm that we are very fortunate to be partners with, and they help us in as many circumstances as possible to hopefully not to quash the subpoena and not have to respond to it. In those situations that we do need to respond, we work with them to make sure that the potential victim, if there is any identifying information or potentially information that could potentially harm the victim, we make sure to work with them to potentially redact it or put some stipulations in place. So short answer is yes, we have been subpoenaed, but the longer answer is that we try to take everyone, just like we do every call, with a unique approach, and hope to do the best we can to keep the potential victims and survivors safe.
Do you guys have any training for remote counties or police departments in rural areas? Have y'all ever done anything like that?
We used to have a team when we were building up the National Human Trafficking Hotline. As we talked about, over 11 years, we built it up. We used to have a regional specialist team who would go out and train different providers on the ground. But now we have found that there are organizations that are local who are able to provide the training. We also are no longer we don't have the resource center part of the hotline that we used to. And instead, the Office of Trafficking in Persons decided to create another branch for another contract that's called the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. And they're the ones we work really closely with to provide training on the ground. Okay.
Let's see. What about, okay, I think we have like one more question. Do any other states have the kind of partnership that you have with Texas?
No, you guys are our special state. This was a inaugural attempt to look at this enhanced partnership. And so we looked at this as a possibility to develop a model that we could replicate with other states.
That's what we like to hear in Texas. All right, we have about 3 minutes left. I think we've answered everybody's questions. Thank y'all so much for being on the call today. And if you guys have any other questions, the hotline is giving you their contact information, and you can also contact us at our website, which is gov.texas.gov/CSTT. Have a great afternoon, everybody.